This is a big day. This is the reconciliation bill. I serve on both the Rules Committee and the Budget Committee, Mr. Speaker, and as you know, we've had some tremendous successes in the appropriations process. You know, this week we've been working through the Commerce, Justice, Science bill. It's a bill that's reduced spending to those levels that we had in 2008, doing those things that the voters sent us here to do. And we're going to vote on that bill today in final passage. But that appropriations process that we have control over here in the House, that process where we've reduced spending from 2010 levels down to 2011 levels, down to 2012 levels, and going to go down again for 2013 levels to be responsible stewards of the taxpayers' dollars, those are only 1/3 of the taxpayer dollars. 2/3 of the taxpayer dollars that are spent in this town, and by spent I really mean borrowed and then spent, come on what they call mandatory spending programs. And Mr. Speaker, as you know, mandatory spending programs are dollars that go out the door whether Congress acts or not. Appropriations bills require Congress act affirmatively, but mandatory spending goes right out the door without any oversight from this body until you get to reconciliation. Reconciliation is that process that Democrats put in place wisely years and years ago to allow the House and the Senate to come together and begin to reduce, restrain, do oversight on those mandatory spending dollars. This is a rule that brings that bill to the floor. Now, that bill is going to be coming under a closed rule, Mr. Speaker. I mean, we're talking about a bill that has been put together by almost every committee of jurisdiction here in this House, and then assembled by the Budget Committee, brought here to the floor. It's been the subject of countless hearings already. We looked at whether or not we'd be able to bring a substitute, a Democratic substitute, to the floor. None was submitted that complied with the rules of the House, and so we have one bill on the floor today, an up or down vote, on whether or not we're willing to engage in the first serious reconciliation process on this floor, I would argue, since 1997. Some folks might say 2003. I'd say 1997. And why, Mr. Speaker? I'd tell you it's the right thing to do anyway. It's the right thing to do anyway as responsible stewards of taxpayer dollars. But in this case, these aren't reductions for the sake of reductions. These are reductions for the sake of complying with what I would argue was a very good deficit reduction agreement between the President and the Senate and the White House last August. And as a part of that agreement, we put in some blanket cuts to national security, some blanket cuts to national defense. As some commentators have described these cuts, Mr. Speaker, as being intentionally so crazy that they would never happen, but would be used only as a tool to get the Joint Select Committee to act. As you know, Mr. Speaker, the Joint Select Committee did not succeed last fall. It's a source of great frustration for me. I know it's a source of great frustration for the members who served on that committee. Had an opportunity to bring an up or down vote to both the House and the Senate floor on anything they came up with, Mr. Speaker. They didn't have to get the whole 1.2. They didn't have to get 1.5. They could have just gotten one. They could have gotten half of one. They could have gotten a quarter of one, and we'd have brought that to the floor for an up or down vote, but they got nothing. So where are we? Well, in the words of Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta, he says we're at a place where if these cuts are allowed to go, the impact of these cuts would be devastating to the Defense Department. Concerns. Again, these were across-the-board cuts put in place to be so intentionally crazy that Congress would never allow them to occur, and it would spur the Joint Committee to action. I happen to have supported, Mr. Speaker, an amendment offered by Chris Van Hollen of Maryland, the ranking member on the Budget Committee, when we were going through the Budget Committee process last year. He offered an amendment that said, dadgummit, everything's got to be on the table, and that includes the Defense Department. I agree with him. The Defense Department does need to be on the table. In fact, the Defense Department is undergoing $300 billion worth of reductions today. This bill does nothing to change that. $300 billion being reduced from the Defense Department, as well it should. It's not easy, but it should happen, and it is happening. This isn't dealing with that. This is dealing with even additional cuts, again in the words of Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta, former Democratic member of this House. Impact of these cuts would be devastating for the department. So we have an opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to do what I would argue you and I came here to do. Not just you and I, but my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. Do those things not just that happen year after year after year, those things that have 12 months of efficacy and then go away, but things that can be set in permanent law to change the direction of spending and borrowing in this country. And candidly, Mr. Speaker, it's more about the borrowing than it is about the spending. There are priorities in this country that we need to focus on. I would argue we've done a great job of focusing on those priorities. But when you're borrowing 40 cents of every dollar from your children and your grandchildren, we have to redefine what responsibility is, because I will tell you that is irresponsible. And this bill then takes a step in two directions. One, turning back this second round of Defense Department cuts, not the first round, but the second round, the round that Leon Panetta describes as devastating to the Defense Department, and then setting us on a path to bend that cost curve going forward by tackling mandatory spending programs for the first time in almost a decade. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to strongly support this rule, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank the gentleman from Georgia, my friend, Mr. Woodall, for yielding me the customary 30 minutes. And I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks, and I yield myself such time as I may consume. Mr. Speaker,
recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in very strong opposition to this rule. It is totally closed, and it denies Democrats, led by Mr. Van Hollen, a substitute. We're not asking for dozens of amendments or something that hasn't been done in the past with regards to reconciliation bills. All we are asking for is one vote on our substitute, one vote on what we believe is a better alternative to the Republican bill. Last night in the Rules Committee, every single Republican, every single one of them, voted to deny Democrats that opportunity. Mr. Speaker, as one who does not believe in arbitrary and thoughtless across-the-board cuts as a way to balance our budget, I want to support Mr. Van Hollen's substitute in order to avoid the implementation of the Budget Control Act sequester. In my opinion, to allow this sequester to go into full effect would be bad for the country. We are here in this awful mess because the so-called super committee failed to reach agreement last fall on a comprehensive and balanced deficit reduction plan, due in very large part to the absolute refusal of Republicans to put revenues on the table. Bowles Simpson, Rivlin Domenici, and the Gang of Six all had deficit reduction proposals that sought to be balanced with both spending cuts and revenues. It sought to be fair. They realized that you cannot solve our long-term fiscal problems by slashing and burning the last century of social progress in America. But today, my Republican friends have brought to the floor a reconciliation bill that actually makes sequestration look good. What's going on here is very simple, very troubling, but very simple. They are protecting the massive Pentagon budget and demanding no accountability, and by exempting it from sequestration, and finding even deeper cuts in programs that benefit the people of this country. The bill before us would create a government where there is no conscience, where the wealthy and well-connected are protected and enriched, and where the middle class, the poor, and the vulnerable are essentially forgotten. I have never seen anything like this. It is outrageous. It takes my breath away. My friends won't cut billions in subsidies for big oil at a time when oil companies are making record profits at the pump. They won't address the inequities of the tax code, which allows billionaire Warren Buffett to pay a lower tax rate than his secretary. The revenues from fixing these two unjust policies alone would result in billions and billions and billions of dollars in deficit reduction. But the Republicans have protected big oil, and they've protected the billionaires. However, my Republican friends take a meat axe to SNAP, formerly known as food stamps. This is a program to help poor people afford food. My friends on the other side of the aisle should heed the words of President John F. Kennedy, and I quote, "If a free society will not help the many who are poor, they cannot save the few who are rich." Mr. Speaker, we are one country. We should care about one another, especially those who are most vulnerable. That's not a weakness or something we should be ashamed of. Rather, it's something that makes us strong and great. As my friends know, I've spent a lot of time and effort in Congress on the issues of hunger, food insecurity, and nutrition. Tens of millions of our fellow citizens don't have enough to eat. And every single one of us, Democrats and Republicans alike, should be ashamed. And that's why I am so outraged by the $36 billion in SNAP cuts. This notion that SNAP promotes a culture of dependency, that SNAP is a golden ticket to prosperity, is just wrong. Some on the Republican side have even claimed that SNAP enslaves Americans. Give me a break. In fact, even in 2010, when unemployment was close to 10% and jobs were scarce, the majority of SNAP households with a non-disabled working age adult were working households. Working households. Working families are trying to earn more. No one wakes up in the morning dreaming to be on SNAP, but these are tough economic times. Some people have no choice. But we know that SNAP enrollment and spending on SNAP will go down as the economy improves, as families see their incomes rise and no longer need SNAP to feed their families. Don't take my word for it. This is directly from the Congressional Budget Office. Of course, last night in the Rules Committee, we heard the tired line that there's a lot of abuse in the SNAP program. We heard that there are countless numbers of people receiving benefits who do not deserve them. That, Mr. Speaker, is simply not true. It is common, and it's a common and unfortunate misconception that SNAP is rife with fraud, waste, and abuse. Many have decried SNAP as a handout that can be sold or traded for alcohol and other items that shouldn't be purchased with taxpayer funds. It cannot. And to the extent that there is abuse, the USDA is cracking down on it. SNAP is both effective and efficient. In fact, the error rate in SNAP is not only at an all-time low, it has among the lowest, if not the lowest, error rate of any federal program. If only we could find a program in the Pentagon that had such a low error rate. Last night we also heard about categorical eligibility, a process in which a low-income person is automatically eligible for food stamps if they are already enrolled in another low-income assistance program. Categorical eligibility, and I think it's important to state this because there's such a misconception here, but categorical eligibility makes it easier for poor people, those who are already approved for other low-income assistance programs, to receive SNAP benefits. But it also makes it easier on the states that have to administer these programs. This saves time and money and paperwork because the people who are already eligible for similarly administered benefits do not have to reapply for SNAP, and states do not have to waste valuable worker hours processing paperwork for people who are already eligible based on their incomes. Categorical eligibility does not mean that people who don't qualify for SNAP get those benefits. To the contrary, people still have to qualify for the program to receive food. Any claim that this is a fraudulent practice or that it is rife with abuse is just another falsehood and smear against one of the most efficient federal programs. The demonization of SNAP and other food and nutrition programs by my Republican friends, it must come to an end. We have an obligation in this country to provide a circle of protection for the most vulnerable. Cutting $36 billion means that more than 22 million households will see a cut in their benefit. This means 22 million families will have less food tomorrow than they do today. In fact, 2 million people would be cut from the SNAP program altogether. Another 280,000 kids would lose access to free school meals. My friends on the other side of the aisle don't like to hear this, but sometimes the truth hurts. If this bill before us becomes law, it will take food out of the mouths of children in America, all in the for wealthy and increase Pentagon spending. The Republican reconciliation bill threatens Medicare, it threatens children's programs, it threatens educational programs, programs that support our infrastructure. In short, if this were to be adopted as law, it would threaten our economy as a whole. And the bill not only protects the Pentagon budget, it increases it by billions of dollars. Does anyone here honestly believe that there's not a single dollar to be saved anywhere in the Pentagon? If you do, you're not reading the newspapers. It's there in front of us every single day, the abuse that goes on, no bid defense contracts, I go on and on and on. We have and we will continue to have the greatest, strongest military on the face of the earth. But at some point, national security must mean more than throwing billions of dollars at unnecessary nuclear weapons or at pie-in-the-sky Star Wars programs that will never actually materialize. But national security has to mean taking care of our own people. It means educating our children. It means an infrastructure that isn't crumbling around us. It means clean air and clean water and a healthcare system that works. Those should be our priorities. But sadly, those are not the priorities in the bill before us today. Now, of course, Senator Reid says the bill is dead in the water in the Senate. In a press conference yesterday, the Senate Majority Leader said, and I quote, "As long as Republicans refuse to consider a more reasonable approach, one that asks every American to pay his fair share while making difficult choices to reduce spending, the sequester is the only path forward," end quote. That's a pretty clear statement that the Senate will not consider this bill. And you go, quite frankly, it's the right thing to do. A reasonable approach is what the American people want. Yes, they want us to get our fiscal house in order. They want us to reduce the deficit in a fair way so that the wealthiest among us pay their fair share. But mostly, the American people want jobs, something that the House Republican leadership continues to ignore. The American people know that the best way to bring this deficit down is through job creation. They want the economy to improve. They want their lives to get better. This bill does not do that. Mr. Speaker, let me conclude by quoting President Dwight Eisenhower in a speech he made in 1953. I quote, "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed," end quote. I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, that President Eisenhower wouldn't recognize today's Republican Party. We should reject this closed rule and the underlying bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserved. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume to say to my good friend, as the Republican budget chairman said to him yesterday, I appreciate his passion on this issue. What brings us to the very best decisions that we can make in this body, Mr. Speaker, is having folks who work hard day in and day out, educating themselves on the issues. They can bring the very best case for the American people to the floor. And that's why I would ask my friend whether or not he believes it actually helps that debate to get involved in some of those rhetorical feats of mind, I guess we'd call them, because he knows as well as I know that under the law of the land in 2002, food stamp benefits, SNAP benefits, would have gone up by about 40% over the last 10 years. And Republicans and Democrats came together over the last decade and increased those benefits 270%. 270%, Mr. Speaker. Now, this proposal suggests that instead of going up 270%, we allow those benefits to go up 260%. That's the draconian cut. I mean, we see that in the same rhetoric in the student loan program, Mr. Speaker. Everyone in this body knows the law of the land was that student loan rates were at 6.8%. 6.8%, a below-market rate of 6.8%. They were lowered for a very small fraction of the student population for a very temporary period of time to 3.4%, and the law now has them going back to 6.8% to standard levels. But folks want to talk about that as a doubling instead of a returning to common law. And more importantly, Mr. Speaker, to continue to suggest, as he knows is not the case, that Republicans are unwilling to focus on the Defense Department, let me say it plainly. I believe there is waste and fraud and abuse in the Defense Department, and I stand here willing to work with you to eradicate it all. I supported Ranking Member Van Hollen's amendment to put defense on the table. The budget that this House passed, the only Washington, D.C., reduced defense spending by $300 billion in recognition of exactly that. And, Mr. Speaker, again, the rhetoric just gets a little overheated from time to time, and candidly, I think it gets in the way of us doing the people's business. When I say to you that Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta on August 4, 2011 said, if these defense cuts happen, and God willing that will not be the case, but if it did happen, it would result in a further round, because we've already cut once, in fact, already cut twice, a further round of very dangerous across-the-board defense cuts that I believe, says Leon Panetta, Secretary of Defense, would do real damage to our security, our troops, and their families. I would say to my friend, how does it advantage us to make this a Republican-Democratic issue when the Democratic chairman of the House Budget Committee, Leon Panetta, says that allowing these cuts to go forward would be dangerous to our defense, to our national security, to our troops, and to our families? How does it advantage us to make this a Republican-Democratic issue when President Clinton's OMB director, Leon Panetta, says this would be dangerous across-the-board defense cuts that would do real damage to our security, our troops, and our families? How does it advantage us to make this a partisan issue when President Clinton's chief of staff, Leon Panetta, former OMB director, former Democratic Budget Committee chairman, says, I believe allowing these cuts to go forward would do real damage to our security, to our troops, and to our families. Do we have real choices to make? We do. I'd be happy to yield to my friend.
We have a substitute amendment. The Democrats have a substitute amendment that would replace the sequester in a different way. It would prevent the across-the-board cuts from happening to defense and the non-defense programs. So there's an agreement that that meat axe approach is the wrong way. We have an alternative. The gentleman just talked about how we have this great debate on ideas on the floor of the House. I have a very simple question. Why are we not going to get an up or down vote on our idea on how we would replace the sequester in a balanced way?
Reclaiming my time, and I thank the gentleman both for his comments and for his offering of that substitute. The reason is threefold. Number one, that substitute doesn't comply with the rules of the House. We made a decision in this body that we were going to not continue to ask for more and more and more out of taxpayers' pockets, but that we were going to try to do our own business here in terms of oversight on all of the money that's already being borrowed and spent and sit out the door. Number two, that happened to be the rules we adopted in this Congress, Mr. Speaker, but under the rules adopted in the last Congress in which you were the budget chairman. You know your substitute would also not have been in order. Under the pay-go rules that you instituted, again, not a Republican-Democratic issue. Under a Republican House, the substitute is not in order. Under a Democratic House, the substitute would not have been in order. But number three, and I would argue most importantly, I say to my friend, we've got a trust deficit with the American people. And it doesn't surprise me. When we talk about the 5-year impact of the reconciliation plan that we passed out of our budget committee, that I hope this House will pass today, we're talking about a net effect on deficit reduction, the process for which reconciliation was created, of $65 billion over 5 years. Over the next 5 years, $65 billion is not going to have to be borrowed from our children and our grandchildren. Under the gentleman's substitute, over that same period of time, spending is actually going to go up by almost $37 billion. This is a process that is designed to reduce borrowing and spending, to reduce the burden we're placing on our children, and the gentleman's substitute increases the burden that we place on our children.
Would the gentleman yield? And I don't want to take up all your time, but just I would like to make the point that what our substitute does is dollar for dollar replace the sequester, which is what our Republican colleagues have said is the object of this effort, which is to make sure we don't have the meat axe approach. And I would just note that the gentleman said that one of the reasons that we're not going to have an opportunity to vote on ours is because it doesn't comply exactly with the rules. In bringing the Republican bill to the floor today, I'm reading right here on the report, the committee report, you waived 3 rules. You waived 3 rules, and yet you can't allow an up or down vote on a substitute amendment. You know you have it within the power to allow our substitute, just as you waived these 3 rules to bring this to the floor.
That what we have within our power is the power to... I'm reading here from today's Congressional Quarterly, because folks sometimes get confused, Mr. Speaker. We talked about the reading clerk and the tough work they have yesterday. Reading today from Congressional Quarterly, it says here, Democrats left open the possibility that they would offer an alternative proposal through a motion to recommit, which is allowed under the rule. My friend on the Rules Committee knows that to be true. My friend on the Budget Committee knows that to be true. I look forward to your using that opportunity to bring your substitute to the floor for a vote. I think that's the right of the minority. I'm glad we preserved the right of the minority, Mr. Speaker. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
I yield myself so much time as I may consume just to reemphasize the point that Mr. Van Hollen made. The Rules Committee has the right to be able to waive the rules to bring any piece of legislation to the floor. And as Mr. Van Hollen rightly pointed out, in the Republicans, in the report on this rule, the Republicans implement waivers because their proposal without these waivers would violate the rules. And so, my friend talks about, that this shouldn't be a partisan discussion. I would just say to my friend that the reason why this is a partisan discussion is because the Republicans have made it such. By denying us the right to come to the floor and offer our substitute, not as a procedural matter, but as a real substitute. You have politicized this debate. You have shut us out. And that is why there is frustration. And I just want to say one other thing again, because I'm so sick and tired of the demonization of programs that benefit poor people in this country, especially the SNAP program. My friend was talking about all this money that we invested in SNAP as if somehow we were giving these very generous benefits out. Just for the record, in 2002, the average SNAP benefit was $1 per meal per day per person. $1. You know, with all the improvements we have made, today it's about $1.50 per meal per day. And it's going to go down next year because of cutbacks we've already made in this program, unfortunately, to offset other things over the past few years. But that means that in a 10-year period, that we have increased this benefit by 50 cents per meal. Now, I don't know about my friend, but you know, $1.50 doesn't go very far today. So when we're talking about trying to help people get through this economic crisis, that's what we're talking about. So this is not some extravagant, overly generous benefit. That's what it is. That's what it is. And rather than cutting waste in the Pentagon budget, which we all know exists, you protect the Pentagon budget. You know, rather than going after subsidies for oil companies and going after you know, billionaire tax breaks, you protect all that. And where do you go to find the savings? At programs that help the poorest of the poor. I mean, it's outrageous. And Mr. Speaker, at this point, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland, the ranking member of the Budget Committee, Mr. Van Hollen.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague from Massachusetts and thank him for his leadership on efforts to ensure that those families who are struggling most in our country continue to have access to food and nutrition, and that children in our country continue to have access to health care. And that's what this debate is all about, because we do have an alternative. There's no disagreement on two things. Number one, we need to reduce our deficit in this country in a credible way. Number two, the Meat Act's approach to the sequester is not a smart way to do it. So how should we go about reducing our deficit? Well, we propose to do it in the same balanced way that every bipartisan commission that has looked at this issue has recommended, through a combination of difficult cuts. And I would remind everybody that just last August, we cut $1 trillion through a combination of cuts, as well as cuts to tax breaks for special interests, and by asking the wealthiest people in this country, people who are making $1 million a year, to contribute a little bit more toward deficit reduction.
Would my friend yield?
I would yield very briefly, yes.
A very, very brief question. My understanding of your substitute is that it raises $3 in taxes for every $1 in spending cuts. Could you tell me which bipartisan commissions have represented that, have also agreed that $3 to $1 is the right combination?
Absolutely. I'm glad the gentleman asked the question. Simpson, Bowles, Rill, and Domenici, they proposed an approach which was about cuts to $1 in revenue, depending on the counting rules. We already enacted $1 trillion in cuts. 100% in cuts. You voted for that. I voted for that. 100% cuts. What this does is, for the next 1 year, we do another $30 billion in cuts, a little over that actually, and then we get about $80 billion through closing loopholes. For example, we say that the big oil companies don't need taxpayer subsidies to encourage them to go drill. They've already testified, their chief executives, they don't need that. They're making plenty right now. We also say that millionaires should pay the same effective tax rate as the people who work for them. And if you take that approach, frankly, with the $1 trillion in cuts we've already made, we are still cutting a lot more than the bipartisan groups recommended compared to the revenue. So our ratio of cuts to revenue is much higher, because those bipartisan groups, they recommended that $1 trillion in cuts, and we adopted that on a bipartisan basis. What they are not doing, what you're not doing, is taking the other part of their recommendation, frankly, which is to say, let's close some of these outrageous tax loopholes for the purpose of deficit reduction. And because 98% of our House Republican colleagues have signed this pledge saying that they won't take 1 penny of additional revenue.
Yield additional 2 minutes to the gentleman.
The gentleman's recognized for additional 2 minutes.
You won't ask 1 penny more for people making over $1 million a year to help reduce our deficit. Not 1 penny. And the math is pretty simple after that. Because you ask nothing of them, your budget whacks everyone else. That's why your budget ends the Medicare guarantee. That's why you cut $800 billion out of Medicaid. And that's why in your sequester proposal here, you whack programs that help the most vulnerable, struggling families. Let's talk about what the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office said about what your proposal would do. 22 million households with children would see their food and nutrition support cut under the SNAP reductions. 300,000 kids will no longer get the school lunch program. 300,000 kids will lose their health coverage under the Children's Health Insurance Program. Those are the decisions you have to make because you don't want to ask the oil companies to give up their taxpayer subsidy. We say the American people would make a different choice. We have that different choice in the substitute amendment. That substitute amendment would prevent those cuts to the Defense Department. It would prevent cuts to NIH and biomedical research. But it would prevent those cuts without whacking seniors and children's health programs. It would do it in a balanced way. We say we don't need the direct payments to agricultural businesses. These are payments that go to ag businesses whether they're making money or not. The spigot's on, we cut those. You don't in your proposal that's before us today. Why not? Instead, you cut the food and nutrition programs. So we think the right approach is the balanced approach that every bipartisan group that's gotten together has recommended. And because 98% of our Republican colleagues have signed this pledge saying they're not going to ask the folks at the very top to put in 1 penny, 1 dime more, you're smacking everybody else. We don't think that's the right way to go. We agree we should reduce the deficit, and we eliminate the sequester, but just in a different way. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 30 seconds to say we just disagree on what balance is. When our proposal for budget reduction is to reduce spending by $65 billion over 5 years, and your proposal for budget reduction is to spend an additional $35 billion over those same 5 years, we disagree on what balance is. We are moving in the wrong direction under your proposal, right direction under our proposal. I'm very proud of our proposal, proud to serve on the committee with my friend. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I would like to yield 3 minutes to the gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Miller.
The gentlelady from Michigan is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank the gentleman for yielding, and I rise to support the rule. And Mr. Speaker, I am very proud to represent Selfridge Air National Guard Base, which is home to the Michigan Red Devils. It's the 107th Fighter Squadron. The 107th, Mr. Speaker, flies A-10s, and they recently returned from a redeployment, actually, from Afghanistan, where they performed so bravely and made us all proud. The 107th was one of the Air Guard units scheduled to be eliminated under the President's budget proposal. But fortunately, the House Armed Services Committee bill here next week, which reverses that and saves the 107th, along with protecting the Air National Guard actually across the entire country. This House is going to do the right thing for the great American patriots of the Air National Guard by prioritizing spending within our budget, not by spending more money. And so I would certainly urge our colleagues in the Senate to join us. And, Mr. Speaker, we need to remember that the cuts that caused the Obama administration to target the Air Guard were before the sequester. If the sequester is allowed to go into effect, the impact on the community that I represent, for example, would be immense. And the defense corridor that we are building as a part of our economic revitalization would be stopped, really dead in its track. Not only would the National Guard, again, be put at risk of massive new cuts, but military contracting across the board would be faced with additional cuts. In Macomb County alone, the county that I'm proud to represent as part of my congressional district, this would mean $200 million in additional cuts, Mr. Speaker, and obviously would cost countless jobs in the defense-related corridor. This House has taken steps to stop the devastation of our Air National Guard, and now it's taking steps to stop the devastation of our defense base and needless loss of jobs with common sense reforms. And so I would urge all of my colleagues to join me in supporting reconciliation today and the defense reauthorization bill that's coming to this floor next week. I yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I'm proud to yield to the gentlewoman from Connecticut, Ms. DeLauro. 5 minutes, I yield.
The gentlelady from Connecticut is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to this bill, which chooses to slash programs that help struggling families get back on their feet without closing a single tax loophole or limiting a single special interest subsidy. Our budget should reflect our values, and as many in the faith community have argued, it should advance the moral responsibilities of the nation to provide for the common good. I note that the Catholic bishops just sent a letter concluding that, and I quote, the proposed cuts to programs in the Republican budget reconciliation fail this basic moral test, end quote. I'm pleased that the bishops are speaking out, as they should. 40% of the total cuts here come from cutting assistance to low, moderate income families, including food stamps, Medicaid, the Children's Health Insurance Program, social services. What this majority is all about. We need to pass legislation that strengthens, rebuilds the middle class of this country, creates jobs, invests in rebuilding our infrastructure, supports manufacturers, and restores fairness to our tax code. This reverse Robin Hood agenda of the House majority fails in every single regard, and I urge my colleagues to oppose it. Yield back.
From Connecticut yields back. The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, when I hear my colleagues talk, it sounds as if we have a choice about doing one thing or another thing. And I will say to my colleagues, when you're borrowing $1.4 trillion a year from your children, just a moment, I'd be happy to yield to my friend. When you're borrowing $1.4 trillion a year from your children, when you're mortgaging the future of this country, it's not a choice of either spending cuts or revenue changes. We got to have both. We've got to have both. And to describe it to the American people as if we can do one or the other and get ourselves out of this mess, we cannot. We absolutely cannot. It takes both. And I would ask my friends, and with this I'd be happy to yield to my colleague, when this House brought to the floor a tax cut bill that gave every member of Congress a tax cut at the end of 2011 that said we only have to pay 4% of payroll taxes that we owe instead of 6% of payroll taxes that we owe, I voted no. I said there's not a member in this body that needs a tax cut. I said we have too big a problem in this nation to give tax cuts to a member of Congress. I voted no. Did anybody else vote no with me? Did anybody else vote no with me? I will not be lectured about how it is that tax cuts are distributed in this country when we have opportunities to cut them on this floor, to eliminate them on this floor, and my colleagues continue to vote yes. We could have added a provision that eliminated those tax cuts for the rich. We did not, and we should have. And with that, I'd be happy to yield to my friend.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. The fact of the matter is that there are choices, and the majority refuses to make those choices. Let us cut the taxes for people who let's not provide the tax cuts for people who are making over $250,000 in this nation. Let us pull back from Afghanistan in an orderly way and save the money. Let us cut the subsidies. Let us cut the subsidies for those who are sending the jobs overseas. Let us cut the agricultural subsidies for people who don't plant anything. Do not cut the food stamp program.
The lady from Connecticut will suspend. The gentleman from Georgia has the time.
I thank the Speaker for his help there. I'm sorry that I needed it, but I appreciate him offering it. We passed a budget in this House, a comprehensive budget in this House. And to hear my colleagues talk, you think this is the only bill we're going to pass for the rest of the year. To hear my colleagues talk, you think we're not going to bring a farm bill to the floor and go after ag subsidies. To hear my colleagues talk, you think we're not going to bring a tax bill to the floor and try to raise revenues in this country. To hear my colleagues talk, this is it. This isn't it. This is the bill that responds to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Martin Dempsey, who said in February of this year about the cuts that we're trying to prevent today, I will tell you that I am prepared to say that sequestration will pose an unacceptable risk. That's what we're here to talk about today. How do we mitigate the unacceptable risk? How do we mitigate against the challenges that former Democratic Budget Committee Chairman, former Clinton OMB Director, former Clinton Chief of Staff, current Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta says threaten our national security? And again, we're going to have a choice, Mr. Speaker. We brought a very powerful program, very powerful proposal to the floor today. Very powerful proposal. For the first time in over a decade, we're trying to get a handle on that out-of-control portion of spending in this budget. Just a little bit, Mr. Speaker, just a little bit. And again, we just have a different idea of what balance is. We have a different idea of what deficit reduction is. My idea of deficit reduction is over the next 5 years, we reduce the deficit. My colleague's idea of deficit reduction is over the next 5 years, we spend an additional $40 billion above and beyond what we were going to borrow and spend anyway. It's a legitimate difference of opinion. I'm glad we're bringing this rule to the floor, Mr. Speaker, so that we can have a vote on that opinion. I look forward to the debate on the underlying bill, and with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
I yield myself 30 seconds
to
respond to the gentleman. First of all, no one here on our side is arguing that sequestration should go into effect. We don't think that's good. But we think that the Republican reconciliation bill is even worse for our country because of the cuts in so many programs that actually help our people. There's no balance in there. The gentleman can say, I'm all for balance. There's none in your reconciliation bill. It's all cuts to programs that actually help the people of this country. And then finally, I just say, we have an alternative to sequestration. Mr. Van Hollen brought that before the Rules Committee last night. The Rules Committee Republicans, every single one of them voted no. Mr. Speaker, at this time I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
I think I'll let this thing cool down a little bit, but the gentleman on the other side of this debate is quite wrong. There's no balance in this particular bill at all. There is no balance. The cuts are devastating. Meals on Wheels for seniors, Medicare programs, Medicaid programs for seniors. And if you take a look at the rest of the issues, school lunch programs, kids are going to go hungry. There's no balance. There is no tax proposal in this. There's no balance at all. But the reason I raised today is to add one more problem that's not being solved by this reconciliation. The National Flood Insurance Bill was folded into this reconciliation, and it has a gaping hole. as the Corps of Engineers has gone through the nation's levees and downgraded those levees, creating an enormous problem for agriculture throughout this nation, and certainly in California, where many of the levees have been downgraded. It's now impossible for farmers and the agricultural community to obtain loans to continue to produce and to enhance their agricultural production. This amendment, which I'd hoped could be put into the bill but was not allowed by the Rules Committee, would simply require an immediate study by the Department of Agriculture and the Federal Emergency Management Agency to undertake a study on the impact of the downgrading of the levees and the resultant inability to get national flood insurance and the impact that that has on the agricultural communities, keeping in mind that agriculture in a flood zone is one of the very best ways to reduce the risk. I would hope that the majority would consider, as this thing moves along, to fold into the National Flood Insurance Program an opportunity for the farm flood program that I've introduced, which would allow farmers to obtain national flood insurance and then the lending that the banks could make available so they can continue to build the necessary facilities for their agricultural production. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman from California yields back. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, there are no tough choices here. I talked to the gentleman whose seat I took the other day. I said, John, you know, when you were up here as a congressman, you made it look fun. Folks are always saying, thank you, thank you, thank you for all the spending that was going on here. I said, I don't get to make any fun decisions. When you've increased the public debt in this country by 50% over the last 4 years, you're all out of giveaway decisions. All we have now are tough decisions. That's all we have. And again, I know that my friend from Massachusetts speaks with passion and conviction. His advocacy for the neediest among us is an inspiration on the floor and in committee and on and on. I don't fault him for that a bit, but I would say to my friend, had we not given that payroll tax cut to members of Congress, we could have provided that food stamp increase that you discussed earlier to an additional 2 million individuals in this country. An additional 2 million individuals in this country had we foregone that tax increase right here. But we didn't. We chose just to go along with the program and cut away, spend away. We can't do that. We've got to stop that. And I would say to my friend, because it's hard. I have the same family struggling in my district that you do. In fact, our foreclosure rate in my district is higher than it is in your district. Our number of folks who are going homeless in Georgia as a result of foreclosures, higher than it is in Massachusetts. But when you talk about the additional 1.8 million folks, 1.8 million folks, Mr. Speaker, according to the CBO, are going to lose their food stamp benefits under this bill. There's no question about that. But here's the thing, Mr. Speaker, and this is important. This bill doesn't cut anybody from food stamps. This bill says the only people who can get food stamps are people who apply and qualify for food stamps. Hear that, Mr. Speaker. The CBO tells us, and my friend from Massachusetts quotes, that 1.8 million people are going to lose food stamp benefits. But the only change this bill makes is that you actually have to apply for the benefits to get the benefits. So that means country are receiving food stamp benefits who would not qualify for food stamp benefits if they had to go and apply. Mr. Speaker, that is not mean-spirited. If you want to change the food stamp rules, if you want to make it a laxer process, whatever you want to do, let's do that. But let's not demonize each other. Let's not say we're trying to throw poor children out in the streets when all we're saying is we have a successful food stamp program, and why don't we just limit it to those people who qualify for it?
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield to my friend from California.
I thank you for the courtesy of the yielding. The fact of the matter is that 1.8 million people will not be able to get the supplemental food that they get from the food stamps. They're going to be hungry. That's a fact. Now, the rest of the fact is the application process has been supported by the federal government and by the legislation so that the states can reach out to those people that are hungry and that are able to qualify for food stamps. That's gone in this bill. So the ability to reach out and to bring into those programs. And beyond that, it is a fact.
My time from my friend, I would say reaching out and bringing folks into the program who do not qualify for the program. The rules for the program are clear, Mr. Speaker. If you qualify for food stamps, I am the first one who wants you to have them. If you qualify for the SNAP program, under SNAP program rules, you should get food stamps. I'd be happy to yield, my friend.
Just so the gentleman understands, the General Accountability Office says the error rate in and the SNAP program is less than 3%. What is he talking about when people are getting benefits that they don't deserve? I'd like to know the numbers of that. How much?
This is important, Mr. Speaker, and I hope folks are paying attention back in their offices. The gentleman is talking about the error rate. The error rate. Folks who have mistakenly gotten food stamps because in the application process, they got the application process wrong. They shouldn't have qualified, but they're giving them away anyway. What the CBO says is something entirely different. What the CBO says is that 1.8 million American families, if they walked into the office today and applied for food stamps today, would not qualify for food stamps. It's not an error. It's not a mistake. It's that the rules of the game have been changed to say we just want everybody. We just want everybody to have a part in the program. When the gentleman says it's a paperwork nightmare for states, I happen to agree with the gentleman. There's a tremendous paperwork challenge for states, but this does not solve that. All we're saying is go through the application process. To suggest that we're trying to take benefits away from people who need those benefits is disingenuous.
The gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to let the gentleman have his own time, Mr. Speaker, because I'm prepared to yield. I'm prepared to reserve.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves. Just by way of time update, the gentleman from Georgia has 6 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Massachusetts has 6.5 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
A half a minute, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman's recognized.
The gentleman is wrong. He's just wrong when he talks about the abuse of the SNAP program, that people are somehow getting benefits that they're not entitled to, and the demagoguery that's going on with regard to categorical eligibility is just inexcusable. That actually cuts paperwork and bureaucracy at a state level, and it helps people who are eligible get the benefits. I'd also, no, I'm not going to yield to the gentleman. You didn't yield to me. I'd also say to the gentleman, he gets up on the floor and talks about this payroll tax cut for members of Congress. That was a payroll tax cut for everybody. Now, if he wanted to exempt members of Congress, that would be minuscule. That would do nothing to provide any benefit to anyone. I reserve my time.
The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I would say to my friend, I wish he would show me the code sections here that go into the SNAP program and say under the SNAP program, the income criteria that we had yesterday, that's changing, and so folks aren't going to get those benefits tomorrow. That's not here. All this bill does is to say you need to apply and you need to earn those benefits on your own merits. When the gentleman talks about paperwork, he knows good and well the CBO took that into consideration. When the CBO says 1.8 million families are no longer going to qualify, it means some of folks are going to get thrown off of categorical eligibility because that is the gaming of the system, and they're going to go back in, they're going to apply for benefits, and they're going to get them. But 1.8 million are going to go back in and apply and get denied because they don't qualify for benefits. Mr. Speaker, if we need to change the eligibility criteria, if we have folks in need who can't qualify, let's change the eligibility criteria. But in the name of good government, when we're going into programs and saying we have rules of the game, we just want people to have to follow them, to somehow define that as being mean-spirited, it galls me. With that, I reserve my time.
The reserve. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, let me give myself a minute.
Gentleman's recognized.
What galls me is that the Republican majority is balancing the budget on the backs of the most vulnerable in this country, the poorest of the poor. The gentleman talks about CBO. CBO says that cutting $36 billion from the SNAP program means that more than 22 million households will see a cut in their benefit. It means that 22 million families will have less food tomorrow than they do today. And in fact, 2 million people would be cut from SNAP altogether. That's not me making up numbers. That's CBO. That's where I get this from. And I think that's cruel and inhumane during one of the most worst economic crises that we've faced. And yes, we have to balance the budget, and we have to make tough choices. But why does it always have to be on the backs of the most vulnerable? Why can't Donald Trump pay a couple of more dollars in taxes? Why can't we end the subsidies to big oil? Why can't we make it so that Warren Buffett pays the same tax rate as his secretary? That's all we're saying here. Your reconciliation bill represents your priorities. And what we're arguing is that your priorities are wrong and bad for the country. We have an alternative. You won't even let us have that opportunity to debate that alternative on the floor.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I would say to my friend from Massachusetts that I'm prepared to close. If he has any more speakers,
I'm it.
then I would yield to my, or I would reserve and enjoy my
Gentleman
friend.
from Georgia reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to urge my colleagues to defeat the previous question. If we defeat the previous question, I will offer an amendment to this close rule to let the House work its will and give Mr. Van Hollen substitute an up or down vote in the House. It deserves more than a procedural vote. And I ask unanimous consent, Mr. Speaker, to insert the text of the amendment in the record along with extraneous materials immediately prior to the vote on the previous question.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, you know, I think what we're talking about here today are two different visions for this country. The Republicans have their vision that is outlined in their reconciliation package. Mr. Van Hollen, I think, has adequately summarized what the Democratic priorities are. The main difference is that in their proposal there is no balance. It's a meat-axe approach to everything. Cut, 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 regardless of what it means to the people of this country. What we're trying to do, and quite frankly what other bipartisan commissions have recommended, is a more balanced approach. We cut spending, but there's also some revenues to be raised. At a time in our country where we have a tax code that allows Warren Buffett to pay a lower tax rate than his secretary, it seems that we can have, it's time for a little fairness. And that's all we're asking for here. That's all we're asking for, is a balanced, fair approach. We're prepared to make the tough choices, and yes, some of those tough choices mean cuts. But I'd say to my Republicans, some of those tough choices may mean that you'll have to go back on the pledge that you signed with Grover Norquist, that you'll have to support closing tax loopholes and raising taxes on the wealthiest individuals in this country. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask unanimous consent at this time to insert in the record a letter from the U.S. Conference on Catholic Bishops. And I want to read one paragraph from that letter to members of Congress. And let me begin, and I quote, "The Catholic bishops of the United States recognize the serious deficits our country faces, and we acknowledge that Congress must make difficult decisions about how to allocate burdens and sacrifices and balance resources and needs. However, deficit reduction and fiscal responsibility efforts must protect and not undermine the needs of the poor and the vulnerable people. The proposed cuts to programs in the budget reconciliation fail this basic moral test. The Catechism of the Catholic Church states, it is the proper role of government to make accessible to each what is needed to lead a truly human life: food, clothing, health, work, education and culture, suitable information, the right to establish a family, and so on. Poor and vulnerable people do not have a powerful lobbyist to advocate their interests, but they have the most compelling needs," end quote. Mr. Speaker, that paragraph sums up what I feel and what so many of us feel about what my friends on the other side of the aisle are doing. You know, yes, we have to make tough choices, but why are always the tough choices on the backs of middle-income families and on the backs of the poor? There are people in this country who are hungry. We're the richest country on the planet, and we have hungry people here. And what is our response? Not to figure out a way to help deal with this terrible scourge, but our response, their response, is to take a meat-axe approach to SNAP, which will cut benefits. That's what CBO says. It will cut benefits. Less food tomorrow than they have today if this were to become law. I think that's a horrible choice. That's not a choice we should be discussing on the floor. Yes, let's make these programs more efficient. But I'm going to tell you, the SNAP program is a hell of a lot more efficient than the Pentagon. I mean, the waste, the fraud, and the abuse in the Pentagon, the wasteful weapon systems in the Pentagon, you know. And I want to tell you, I don't care what Leon Panetta says. There's savings to be found in the Pentagon budget. And we ought to go after that. And we ought to make sure that Donald Trump pays his fair share in taxes. And we ought to close these corporate tax loopholes that allow corporations to get away with paying no taxes. Middle-income families can't do that. I mean, this is about fairness. That's what we're looking for, fairness and balance. This is a tough time, but, you know, rather than following the European model, which my friends seem to love, of austerity and cut, which is not very popular, as they're seeing, what we're trying to do here is, you know, make responsible cutbacks and responsible investments, investing in a robust highway bill to put people back to work, investing in education, make sure our young people are prepared to compete in the 21st century economy. And yes, investing in a social safety net, investing in programs that provide a circle of protection to the poor and the most vulnerable. There's nothing wrong with that. We should be proud of the fact that we're a country that cares. You know, let's not give that up. That's a strength. It's not a weakness, it's a strength. And I said to my colleagues, my biggest problem with what the Republicans are doing is it fails that test. What it does is it goes after the most vulnerable in a way that I think is cruel and wrong. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to vote no and defeat the previous question. I urge a no vote on the rule. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my friend from Massachusetts for joining me on the floor today, and I'd say I think he chose exactly the right choice of words when he was trying to make his points. Describe your opposition as hating women and children, and that's your best chance of winning your argument, if only it were true. And that's what I hope American people take home from debates like these, Mr. Speaker, is that there are serious challenges here, and there are serious people who are here trying to solve these challenges. But we get wrapped around the axle in the name-calling here that I would argue does nothing to feed a child, does nothing to take care of a family. The gentleman says that we're the richest nation in the world. I would tell the gentleman there's no poor nation on the planet. There is not a nation on the planet that has borrowed more money than this nation has. Not one. Not one. What do they say about socialism, Mr. Speaker? It's a great plan until you run out of other people's money. Guess what? We're run out of other people's money. I just want to show you a chart, Mr. Speaker. This is a chart, and I'll show it around so other members can see it. The green line represents tax revenues in this country. It goes back to 1947, and what you'll see is tax revenues are fairly flat as a percent of the economy. In fact, because this chart goes all the way back to 1947, it reflects the New Deal with FDR, reflects all of that growth in government. The red line is the spending, government spending. It goes all the way back through 1965. It reflects Lyndon Johnson and all the Great Society spending that goes on. And what you'll see, and I just want to make sure all my colleagues can see it there, the red line representing where spending is going in this nation, the green line representing where taxes are historically in this nation. Mr. Speaker, does this look like we have a tax problem here? Does it look like we have a spending problem in this nation? Taxes have remained the same as a percent of GDP as have spending until now. Until now, we have a spending-driven crisis in this nation. I'd say to my friend, again, he chose all the right talking points. They want to protect the rich. They want to protect the oil companies. I will tell you there is one bill, Mr. Speaker, and you know it well. There is one bill in this Congress that eliminates every single corporate loophole, exemption, deduction, and break. There's one. That same bill, Mr. Speaker, eliminates every loophole the wealthy use to avoid paying their fair share. Every one. Mr. Speaker, it is the single most popularly co-sponsored tax bill, fundamental reform bill in the House and in the Senate. It has almost 70 members in the House, it has 9 members in the Senate, and there is one Democrat on it. One. Mr. Speaker, given the right speech down here about what folks ought to do, doesn't move us in the right direction. Putting your name behind some legislation and moving something forward gets us in the right direction. This Budget Committee chairman sitting here beside me, I'm so proud of him. Chairman Paul Ryan, that's a name known around this country as a man who is trying. There aren't many folks who are known for trying, who say, I don't care about the slings and the arrows. America is facing crisis, and if not me, then who? We got that in the House-passed budget, Mr. Speaker. Folks who said, if not me, then who? And they made tough choices. Here we have the first reconciliation bill. First reconciliation bill. My colleagues on the other side are going to offer a motion to recommit to this deficit reduction bill that actually increases spending and call that balance. Mr. Speaker, food stamp program spending has increased 270% over the last decade. The mean-spirited folks that my colleagues talk about want to increase it by 260% instead. These aren't easy decisions, Mr. Speaker, but they're not going to put one family that qualifies for food stamps out. Not one. Not one. We're going to move beyond the demagoguery, Mr. Speaker. We're going to move into the real business that governing this nation takes. I hope we'll get a strong bipartisan vote on this rule. I hope we'll get a strong bipartisan vote on the underlying bill. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of both the rule and the underlying bill. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time, and I move the previous question.
The gentleman from Georgia yields back, all time having expired. The question is on ordering the previous question on the resolution. Those in favor say aye.